It was 1997 when Paul Verhoeven decided to grace our eyes, ears, and screens with Starship Troopers, the patriotic pulp film of its time. On the surface, it was visually extravagant and set the story like it was going to be this dazzling space war saga with battles and explosions. But underneath the surface, this comical movie was actually all about fascism, blind obedience, and jingoism getting parodied to the fullest. But nobody truly got it. And that's why Starship Troopers is treated the way it is. So you gotta wonder, what happened? How did Starship Troopers end up like this? So let's go back in time, 1959. To be more precise, Robert A. Heinlein wrote a novel in that year with the same name that is considered to be one of the most polarizing works in the genre of science fiction. This novel is one of the key texts in military science fiction and even won the Hugo Award. In this story, Earth is governed by a militarized society, and voting rights and full citizenship are achieved only through federal service. The armored fighting force, known as the Mobile Infantry, is glorified as the peak of civic virtue, while the society around them functions based on rank, duty, and discipline. And over the years, critics have seen the novel in different lights. Some think this story tells you a story of militaristic propaganda in sci-fi drag, while others think it is a thoughtful but rigid exploration of civic responsibility. The story is rendered extra believable owing to Heinlein's background as a Navy man and his infusion of strong libertarian and authoritarian currents in his work. So overall, I would say that this story is both a cautionary tale and a blueprint. Now, we come to the 1990s. Sony greenlit the film adaptation of this book, and they decided to get Dutch director Paul Verhoeven on board for this movie. The Dutch director has already made an impact on the American audience with his hit movies Total Recall and RoboCop, so he was the right person to head this project as he was no stranger to satire and social commentary. But there was a small problem with the whole idea. Verhoeven did not have an interest in Heinlein's book. He didn't want to make a faithful adaptation simply because he found the novel extremely ideologically rigid and dull. So, instead of finishing it, Verhoeven was given the TLDR by screenwriter Edward Newmere. And after hearing that little TLDR, Verhoeven decided that he wanted to flip everything. So in the story, the world is presented as a utopia, right? But when Verhoeven heard about it, he did not feel the same way about the story. Instead, he felt like the story was just fascism in your face. So instead of bringing the utopia vibes on screen, Verhoeven decided to bring the fascism on screen just the way the story put it. So in a way, you could say that Starship Troopers does not subvert Heinlein's story by contradicting it. Instead, they subvert the story simply by following it to the letter. Johnny Rico, Carbon Ibanez, and Carl Jenkins are all characters from the book, but Verhoeven stylized them as propaganda cutouts instead of the heroes that Heinlein painted them to be. When you watch the film, if you are a history nerd, you can immediately spot just how eerily similar the soldiers' uniforms are to the Nazi stormtroopers' uniforms. The government broadcasts that we see in the movie, the recruitment ads, and the whole shebang are in-your-face parodies of real-world wartime propaganda. The cinematography in these propaganda shots is very reminiscent of Triumph of the Will, the infamous Nazi documentary by Leni Riefenstahl. Verhoeven's version of Earth is a very cold and dry parody of the world. This isn't a bad thing, of course, but back then, this is where the trouble started. You see, crowds back then were well acquainted with parody, like you saw in Spaceballs. But when they saw Starship Troopers, they were not sure how to react. When they walked into the theaters, they were expecting Independence Day with bugs. But instead of that, they got Dr. Strangelove in a military uniform. In fact, Starship Troopers got a thumbs down from Roger Ebert because he felt like the movie was pitched by several 11-year-olds. He talked in detail about how he didn't know if the movie was simply poorly made or if it was a joke. And that was an emotion echoed by the audience. A lot of viewers felt that the stiff acting and the hollow dialogues were mistakes, when in reality, they were actually choices that Verhoeven had intentionally made. And Verhoeven's casting choice of getting really wholesome looking leads who were attractive by that time's beauty standard did not help the case at all. Casper Van Dien played Johnny Rico is the parody of those perfect blonde-haired, blue-eyed patriots we have seen in other war movies. He delivers his line with sincerity, but they fall so flat that in the end, he loops around back into brilliance. Carmen, played by Denise Richards, is this grinning flyboy who sacrifices emotion for duty. And then you have Neil Patrick Harris, playing Carl, who becomes the ultimate punchline when he appears in the full costume, embracing the militarized psychic warfare. So, obviously, this movie was supposed to be heavy-handed satire. Something that is delivered in the most straight-faced way possible with no nudges in the ribs or laughter. It is presented earnestly so that the satire works. But this earnestness is what doomed it, because the film became completely indistinguishable from the real fascist propaganda film, especially for viewers who were not familiar with the visual grammar that he was referencing. As you can guess, Heinlein's fans were up in arms. They were hoping for a movie where they only saw the celebration of civic virtue and military brotherhood, and the movie they got was not at all about that. So in their eyes, this film was a mocking indictment of everything the book stood for. So in fan forums and sci-fi circles, the movie was considered an abomination. Say what you want, but Verhoeven truly achieved what was impossible at the time. He somehow managed to make a film that pissed off both sides of the ideological spectrum, but for completely different reasons. This movie is the ultimate personality test. Was it a parody of fascism? Or was it anti-fascist? Was this movie earnest or sarcastic? No one could tell. And even to this day, people are debating whether Verhoeven's adaptation was a cautionary tale about satire without a signal or a subversive masterpiece. And on top of all that, Verhoeven's interviews did not help. He said outright how he wanted to show what a fascist utopia would look like if you actually followed Heinlein's ideals. He called the Federation a perfect fascist world. But with the way he presented the Federation in the movie, the cinema ended up seducing the very minds that it originally set out to critique. But then again, as you look into the movie, you will realize that the Starship Troopers was meant to fail from the very first day. The failure was written into its DNA. This story was too clever for its own good. The satire was too dry, and the performance too earnest, and the audience that showed up at the theaters was too eager to take everything at face value. So instead of being the next big science fiction franchise, this movie became the sci-fi equivalent of a misunderstood joke in the wrong crowd. That is what great satire is all about. It doesn't always land the right way. So even though the film had bombed amongst the mainstream audiences, many years later, the seeds it planted grew into its very own fan following. And now, the movie is considered a cult classic, because now, the new generation of film watchers finally understands what Verhoeven was trying to do. This movie is a litmus test on how well we actually understand the media that we consume. But I don't think that the movie failed just for its biting social commentary, which was presented as deep satire that we talk over people's heads. Because, surprise, surprise, there is more to it. The movie also failed because of the flawed machinery behind it. The movie's collapse at the box office can be described as the marketing team and the director not agreeing on the same vision. Let me explain. So, Sony Pictures and TriStar had greenlit Starship Troopers with the idea of turning it into a big-budget action movie. It was ambitious and had a budget of $105 million, which might not seem a lot now, but back then, it was a lot. Paul Verhoeven had a clear vision of the movie, but that vision did not align with the idea the studio had. The studio wanted the movie to be a straightforward, typical sci-fi blockbuster, and this disconnect between the two ended up haunting every aspect of the promotional campaign. In the film industry, marketing sets an example. That is a glimpse of what is yet to come. It is the appetizer. And thanks to Sony, the marketing did not succeed in telling the fans what the movie was about. The trailer spun a story of this testosterone-drenched bug-hunting campaign in space, while the posters gave us heroic shots of soldiers in mid-battle. The tagline, "The only good bug is a dead bug," was plastered everywhere as this war cry, and not a parody. And before you think these choices were accidents, let me tell you, they were not. They intentionally made these choices because they wanted to market the film to the same crowd that enjoyed Independence Day and Men in Black just months earlier. So with no indication of satire, glimpses of the faux propaganda newsreels, winks to the audience or irony, Sony made the movie seem like it was the next Alien. So while the fans were expecting Top Gun in space, the audience ended up with 1984, with bugs. A lot of people assumed that the problem could have stemmed from studio executives who had no idea what the satire was all about. This disconnect could have been avoided if the film's release date had been chosen better, but it wasn't. Sony dropped the film into an overcrowded blockbuster season on November 7th, 1977. This time slot proved to be a bloodbath because it was surrounded by The Fifth Element, Alien Resurrection, Tomorrow Never Dies, Titanic, The Lost World Jurassic Park, and so on. So during that time, the science fiction fans were completely blessed to the fullest. By the time Starship Troopers arrived, the audiences were simply uninterested in another space war flick, especially a film that was led by a cast like the one we saw in this movie. There is no denying that Denise Richards, Dinah Meyer, and Casper Van Dien are gorgeous. They are, but they weren't super popular. They lacked the kind of star power that brings butts to seats. The only bankable names in this movie were Clancy Brown and Michael Ironside, but they weren't A-list material. Sony's gamble on a cast of fresh faces did not pay off, despite their talent, because the marketing sucked. And this is the segue to another crucial behind-the-scenes issue for this film. The studio completely failed to communicate the film's tone. The shoot went relatively smooth, and Industrial Light and Magic handled the visual effects, rendering the bugs quite horrifying and fluid. The battle sequences were huge in scope and multi-layered, as well as complex. So visually, the movie looked the part. But that was not enough to save the movie. During test screenings, studio execs reported that the movie felt weird. Some felt that the humor undercut the action, while others were not sure about Verhoeven's stand on the fascist overtones. The confusion got worse as they saw the propaganda newsreels that Verhoeven had inserted into the film right before major plot points. Those segments exaggerated censorship, glorified violence, and gleefully portrayed state media, which made things worse. Insiders say that Sony actually pushed for those elements to be minimized in the trailer campaigns, which resulted in most of them being left out and the ones shown being framed without irony. So because of all that, the audience ended up coming out of the theaters disappointed. When the movie opened, it debuted as #1 and even pulled $22 million in the opening week. But by the second weekend, the box office numbers had plummeted over 50% and the movie had no momentum. Ultimately, the movie only brought in $121 million, which, after considering the marketing and distribution fees, put Sony at a loss. This movie is the classic example of what happens when creativity and corporate promotion clash against one another. Verhoeven knew what he wanted, but because of the studio interference, the movie ended up being a complete misfire. Verhoeven did not want nuance with this film. He wanted to showcase fascist propaganda for all it was, as an experiment, and with how many audience members took it to be true, shows how successful his experiment was. But for the studios, none of that mattered. The movie had grossed only $54 million domestically and $66 million overseas, and that was simply not enough for Sony, especially when compared to other science fiction movies that came out that year. So this movie was a huge financial disappointment. So no sequels for the movie. Verhoeven did hint that he wanted to expand the story and build a franchise, but the financial result of the movie made that impossible. So Sony retreated, and the movie was stowed away. No merchandise, no toys, no game tie-ins, nothing. You would think this would be the end of the movie, but nope, something was happening right under the surface. Right when everyone thought there was no hope, the film started to gain attention, and this time the audience was in on the joke. Neil Patrick Harris's really questionable Nazi cosplay was not considered chilling. People started quoting, "Would you like to know more?" as a joke. And by the mid-2000s, the film reached cult classic status. Video essays and retrospectives talking about Verhoeven's vision started to come out. Scholars even cited the film in media studies classes. The movie that was labeled too dumb to succeed was now labeled as too smart for its time. Even on Rotten Tomatoes, the movie went through a full rehabilitation. Now, Starship Troopers sits at a 72% on the tomato meter. Modern critics and film historians, along with general audiences, have understood that Starship Troopers was not a failure. Michael Ironside, who played Lieutenant Razak, spoke in interviews about how the US and European audiences received the film. According to him, in Europe, people understood that this was a parody the moment they recognized the Nazi imagery. But the American audience took it at face value. This resulted in a cultural divide that completely changed how the film was received by two sets of audiences. The resurgence of the film also led to new discussions about its relevance. In this era of aggressive military propaganda, post 9/11 and post-Iraq wars, Starship Troopers felt more like prophecy. Somehow, Verhoeven's deadpan tone hit harder than ever before in the modern climate, and the movie made sense in a way it had never before. The satire of this movie has aged like fine wine in comparison to other movies of that age. The digital effects may be janky sometimes, but they hold up relatively well overall. The cleanly shot action, paired with the brutal political messaging, makes the film feel sharper than ever before. The film's concepts about manufactured consent and the dehumanization of the enemy are more relevant than ever now. And because of that, you could say there is a sort of poetic justice to Starship Troopers. It may have lost money in 1997, but over the years, it has gained cultural capital, and now it is being studied as a model of stealth satire. Its memes, its quotes are all legendary. Verhoeven's decision to play the movie completely straight is the reason why the movie endures even to this day. So even though the movie took years to blast off, when it did, its echoes were heard everywhere. Now that the generation was ready for it, it was time for sequels and revivals. The first revival came in 2004 with Starship Troopers 2, Hero of the Federation. Verhoeven and the original cast were nowhere to be seen, and so was the satire. This movie went full horror mode. We got more claustrophobic tension and body-snatching bugs instead of world building and greater satire. On paper, this should have been a great idea, but on screen, it was like a rejected Stargate SG-1 episode. The tone was completely confusing, and the political commentary was gone. The movie was built on a tiny budget and went straight to DVD. Neither the fans nor the critics paid any attention to it, but this was not the final nail in the coffin. In 2008, we had Starship Troopers 3, Marauder, which was kind of like a return to form. We saw the return of Casper Van Dien as Johnny Rico, and the satirical bits that made the original stand out were back to a degree. The movie was not on Verhoeven's level of satire. Instead, it was more like diet satire. The bugs were back, and we got a subplot about bug-worshipping cult with a budget that was a bit better than the last one. This movie was a step up from the second film, but it was also like a wink to the fans, acknowledging the roots of the franchise at least. After the third film, we entered the digital phase of this franchise. In 2012, we got an animated film directed by Shinji Aramaki, titled Starship Troopers Invasion. This movie looked more polished than all of its predecessors, and finally brought back Rico and Carmen. This movie was polished and slick in comparison to the other movies that came before it, but it did not bring back the satire like the original film. This was more of an action film, feeling closer to a Call of Duty campaign instead. Then in 2017, we got Starship Troopers, Traders of Mars. Starring Van Dien and Dinah Meyer, this film was more of a fan service than game changer. This movie, as you can guess, is set on Mars and plays more like a love letter to the original, while also expanding the lore. We got nostalgic dialogue, tighter pacing, and definitely better animation with this film. But by this point, the series was all about stomping bugs and not so much about commentary. And that is what is so fascinating about the franchise. All of the sequels missed the mark that Verhoeven hit back in '97. They aimed for every genre under the sun, but none of them could present that unique blend of shiny patriotism mixed with authoritarian rot. So soon, the franchise ended up becoming a sci-fi brand. But that is all that happened in the film world. In the gaming world, the Starship Troopers went through its own evolution. In 2022, we got Starship Troopers Terran Command, which was a real-time strategy game. This game was set in the film universe, and you were the boss, planning out the tactical battles against the arachnids. The game earned praise for its thematic consistency with the movie and the visuals, but the fans noticed how it lacked depth and had repetitive gameplay. Then we got Starship Troopers Extermination. The game launched fully in 2024, after its early access sneak peek in 2023 as a first-person shooter game that threw the players into large-scale bug battles. It was a gore galore with base building and team coordination. However, the most notable feature of the game is that they brought back Van Dien as Rico's voice. This game leans completely into the aesthetic and Verhoeven's tone. giving us war propaganda style tutorials. How cool is that? And this brings us to the biggest news in the Starship Troopers saga, the long-rumored reboot. In 2023, news came out stating that Sony and Columbia Pictures have tapped Neil Blomkamp, the mind behind District 9, Elysium, and Chappie, as the director behind a new reboot of Starship Troopers. But instead of following the Verhoeven style of satire, this film wanted to return to its original roots, Heinlein's original novel for tonality and structure, which means we will get more earnest military themes than ever in a very straightforward depiction of a fascist utopia. And as you can guess, this completely split the fanbase. On one side, you have the Heinlein purists, who are happy that, finally, they are going to get a version of the film that treats the novel with reverence. On the other hand, you have fans of Verhoeven's Starship Troopers who are not at all happy about the fact that this reboot is going to be the very thing the 1997 film was mocking. And I completely get where they are coming from. Rebooting Starship Troopers without the satire sounds like a recipe for disaster. This is a creative and a cultural risk. We live in an age where the authoritarian aesthetic and military propaganda are far less taboo than they once were. So a film that embraces those themes without questioning them could probably land poorly. Now, the danger is not that people will not get satire, the danger is that there may be no satire at all. But fans still hold on to hope because Blomkamp is not new to morally complex sci-fi stories. But now we're wondering if he will go full Heinlein or if he will insert some subversion under the radar. Very little is known about the reboot and the cast, but there is no denying that this is Sony's most quietly anticipated project. So after many years of detours, we are finally here. Starship Troopers is here, at the verge of reinvention. Now, whether the reinvention will be good enough for the fans remains to be seen. Marvelous verdict. Starship Troopers may come off as a movie all about monstrous bugs and crushing them, but it's never about that. It was always about how easily we end up cheering for the same people who are suffocating us, as long as there is patriotism involved. Paul Verhoeven turned the fascist fever dream into a diabolical satirical smack that took quite a few years to land. But now that it has seen its cultural resurrection, there's no stopping it. The franchise now stands at a crossroads with this new reboot on the line, and we, as fans, are more than excited to see how the war is going to end. Would you like to know more? And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one, be safe, and thanks everyone.